Nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram vancha kalpatarubhyascha kripas sindhubhyaeva cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Namah Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambujo Radha Madana Mohano Kuladi Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Seva Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhaktamaj Jai Rachilo Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Galaye Shila Tahate Na Hoilo Murachita Jeva Nahi Puji Keva Shunite Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Caitanya-carit Krishna upajive priti janive rasarariti shunile borohohit shriyatam shriyatam nityam giyatam giyatam ra chintyatam bhakta Caitanya-caritamrta. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojanavatar, Prema Purushottam, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad nourished by Shri Rup, Shri Sanatan, Shri Jiva, Shri Raghunath, and Mahaprabhu's other beloved Parshads, Srila Krishna Das, Kaviraja Gosvami. Again, today we're blessed to absorb ourselves in Sri Caitanya-caritamrta. So we'll resume where we left off in Madhya Lila 22. We've begun the discussion of the Abhidheya, Krishna Bhakti. So in the last discussion, we began this chapter and we heard a summary of how Krishna is the Sambandha Tattva, namely the Sambandhi Tattva, and how he exists in the form of his own Swarup, as well as his extended self-manifestations or Svamsas, as well as Jivas, the Vibhinangshas, the separated parts, and how these Jivas are categorized as of two types, although constitutionally they're identical, in that one is considered to be beginninglessly or eternally attentive or aware of Krishna, and one is said to be oblivious or unaware of Krishna. So today we'll hear a little bit more about these two categories of jivas, and then the rest of the chapter will be pertain to the second group, or in other words, the first group who are eternally with Krishna, eternally liberated. They don't need any advice, they don't need Shastra, they don't need the Abhideya Tattva, etc. But this second group does. So to take care about this second group, the teachings for the remainder of the chapter are discussed. So let me share the text in the box, and then we will begin. Oh dear, where did I put it? Sorry, one sec. Here it is. Okay, should be there now. Then I'm starting from Payar number 11. No comment or question before I start, I assume. Nitya Mukta Nitya Krishna Charanayun Muk Krishna Parishad Nama Bunje Sevasuk. The eternally liberated are eternally intent upon Krishna's feet. They are known as, quote, Krishna's associates, and they experience the bliss of service to Krishna. So, as we've discussed in the past, but I'll just reiterate, this concept of awareness is figuratively represented by reference to the face. So the word mukh is perhaps the most common word in Sanskrit for the face. So in conventional experience, when we're facing something, then we're aware of that. But what we're facing away from, we may not see with our eyes, which are the most dominant of our senses, so we may not be aware that it is there. So taking the face as a representative of what we're aware of, to describe someone as unmukh is to say that they are upon face or toward face of something, literally speaking, which implies that they're intent upon it, they're paying attention to it, their eyes, their gaze, their awareness is directed in that way. So this is the eternally liberated group, the beginninglessly never been in Maya group. They're always had this awareness of Krishna's feet, and therefore they're always relishing this bliss of service to him. So now, in contrast, we hear about the second group. Nitya Baddha Krishna Hoite Nitya Bahirmukh Nitya Sangsari Bunje Narakari Duk. The eternally bound, or Nitya Baddha, are eternally oblivious of Krishna. They are eternal samsaris and experience the suffering of Naraka and so on. So we have antonyms here, unmukh, or upon face or toward face, and bahirmukh, out face or away face. And we see other synonyms elsewhere here in the Caritamrta or in the Sandarbhas. We also see the word vimukh, which is the same as bahirmukh, to be without the face in that direction, or the face in contrary or away from that. And we also hear the term sammukh, which would mean with face, in other words, facing towards something. So all of these terms, bahirmukh, vimukh, and their opposites, unmukh, sammukh, all just convey this idea of the presence and absence of awareness. So, as we discussed last time, here the word eternal means beginningless. So they're beginninglessly unaware, or they're beginninglessly facing away. In other words, they've never had awareness of him. So they're oblivious. They're not aware of him, and they're not aware that they're not aware of him, because they're not aware that he exists. It's one thing to be not presently aware of something that you acknowledge exists, but when you're unaware that you're even unaware, then a stronger word is you're just oblivious. In other words, when someone has some sort of misbehavior that's really disturbing, that they obviously don't even realize is disturbing the people around them, then we describe the person sometimes as they're out of it, or they're out of touch, or they have no insight, or they're oblivious of their behavior upon other persons. So this is the situation of the jiva. Broadly speaking, that they're unaware of what's most important to be aware of. And in this state of unawareness, they are bound. And as such, they remain perpetually in samsara. So they're called samsaris, or those who are in samsara. And they experience suffering, such as naraka. So this is a strong way to describe suffering. Sometimes you see a lot of cases in Sanskrit writing that they'll refer to a category and then they'll mention one item of the category to give, or sometimes two, to give the idea of what they're referring to. So they say, and they experience suffering. So how should we characterize the suffering that jivas go through? They suffer, when, the internet goes out for 5 minutes, that kind of suffering. Is it like this mild, benign sort of thing? So it seems here there wants to be a little force pressed upon this point that samsara contains very severe forms of suffering. So let's represent the suffering of samsara with hell. So the term naraka is loosely equivalent to the, word hell. The Bhagavatam describes 21 such realms of severe forms of acute misery in the 5th canto. So obviously not all suffering is that severe, but the point of this whole discussion is to give people some pause to think seriously about their existential condition and its scope. So I think for that reason, this, you could say, extreme item within the category is mentioned as the example. So now that's unpacked a little bit further. So I move to the next one. He says, Se doshe maya pishachi danda kore tare adhyatmikadita patraye jari tare mare. Because of that deficiency, the pishachi maya punishes them. She withers and torments them with the 3 miseries, those related to the self and so forth. So when it says, quote, that deficiency, then this is the deficiency that was mentioned just a minute ago, this absence of awareness. And the consequence of that absence of awareness is that Maya takes her, puts her effect over the jiva. So it's significant here, and this is a subtle point which comes out in Jiva Goswami's commentaries on the verse Tvayam Dvitiya Bhiniveshata Syat and elsewhere in the Bhagavatam, that the jiva's absence of awareness is not caused by Maya. This absence of awareness is there, and in response to it, or quote, because of it, Maya then suppresses the jiva's awareness of self, distracts it into a sense of non-self, allows the subtle body, the gross body, the realm of samsara to envelop the jiva, and thereafter that subtle body to get programmed with all these varieties of inclinations and aversions and attachments and so forth. So it's not that our quote-unquote constitutional it's not that constitutionally the absence of the jiva's awareness is caused by Maya. The jiva in its constitution only knows itself. So it's not necessarily at fault for just being what it is, or just having awareness that's limited to its own constitution. And so that point is important because sometimes, persons can interpret, some of these statements have been interpreted either to mean that the jiva is like a criminal and that Maya, is therefore punishing them and one should be ashamed of oneself for one's situation. This is one line of thought. And another line of thought is that we're forgetful of Krishna because of Maya, and Maya is like Satan, or Maya is like some evil force that's constantly causing us to suffer and be against Bhagavan or be against our own will. But although Maya's effect can appear to have that influence upon the jiva, in and of itself it's not. So that's something we'll unpack a little bit more. But I'd like to discuss here also this word pishachi and the metaphor that's developed from this payar into the next 2 payars. So a pishachi is something we hear about even in the Vedas, not just in the Puranas. and is some type of fiend or evil spirit, which the male form is called a pishacha and the female form is called a pishachi. Perhaps the female form is used here because Maya is also conceived of as feminine, so the metaphor is conceived using a feminine form. So this pishachi or pishacha is said to be an entity which can feed on human flesh, which can also cause mental illness, cause and haunt people like ghosts, and so on and so forth, and is mentioned in the Bhagavatam and various Puranas. And even in the Vedas, we find description of mantras which are prayed for to free people from these pishachis, or in other words, a form of what's called exorcism, or removing this ghostly or this, the influence of this evil spirit from a person. So I did a little research on this to develop the commentary and contextualize it, and there's things even in the Atharva Veda that describe prayers to Agni Dev to come and devour with his flames this pishacha which has bewitched such and such person, and so forth. So we have here a pretty fearsome metaphor. Even some take the etymology of the word pishacha, pisach, ach, coming from ad, which means to consume, and pish is one of the roots from which a word for flesh comes. So some take it etymologically, though all don't agree, that it can mean flesh eater. So this, like it may not be human, so we can't exactly call it a cannibal, but this like human flesh devouring fiend is about as scary as a thing as I can imagine. So this is a pretty, daunting way to metaphorically represent Maya. And moreover, that, the word danda is that type of entity is now coming to punish you. It's like, wow, that's scary. Or, that's a metaphor that evokes fear or alarm. However, we want to understand the subtlety of the metaphor as well, which is that it's not entirely meant to be taken that way. In other words, every metaphor has a limited scope of application. The object of comparison and the subject of comparison are not identical entities. There's some overlap in qualities between the two, and those are the qualities that the metaphor is being used to highlight. But it doesn't imply that all the qualities of the two are equivalent. So to read this properly, we have to then identify what are the qualities that Maya and a pishachi share, and also which are the qualities that they don't. So we find in one comment of Jiva Gosvami, in particular, on the 11th canto in his Kramasandarbha, where he specifically mentions that just as Maya suppresses the awareness of the jiva, subjects the jiva to samsara, when it sees that the jiva is bahirmukh, or devoid of awareness of Bhagavan. So also, whenever Maya sees a jiva is unmukh, or has awareness of Bhagavan, the jiva supplies or supports the self-awareness of that jiva and does not subject that jiva to the confinement of samsara, and if the jiva is in samsara, Maya immediately liberates that jiva. So what we can understand from that is that this punishment of Maya is not like some fiend that's like living off of these victims by devouring their flesh to exploit them, but rather this is simply a response to the existential state of the object, which means it's something that's being done on a principle, which is to say it's something that's being done as a duty, as a task, without any personal judgment of the entity. So, in other words, these entities that have this awareness, treat them like this. These entities that don't, treat them like that. Okay, like a policeman or like a judge, like when the person, was present at this crime scene at this and this time, okay, then this is what's due to them, and when they're not, then they're not. There's no partiality or malevolence on the part of a judge. That's called impartiality, rather. So that's what I want to emphasize, is that although Maya is being compared to a pishachi in this case, it doesn't mean that Maya has a malevolent nature. Rather, Maya has an impartial, and in a broader sense, even a supportive nature. Because for some, the word punishment can evoke something undesirable or something that seems like a tormentation of oneself. But here, the word punishment is in the sense of correction. So, mothers also punish their children. Does that make them malevolent to the children? Absolutely not. Rather, that's an act of love. That's an act of support. That's an act that's necessary for the well-being of the child. That's an expression of the mother's love. So, again, that the verb in the sentence is punish also need not evoke the connotation that Maya is not in the best interest, not acting in the best interest of the jiva. Rather, it's doing this as a task as it's so dictated to Maya by Bhagavan, and ultimately this corrective influence of Maya is in the best interest of the jiva. Because for the jiva to lack awareness of Bhagavan has, we can say, an infinite opportunity cost. When you could be experiencing this infinitely wonderful thing for an infinite amount of time, and you remain perpetually in the absence of that experience, how much value are you missing out on? Right? If corporate executives calculate, how much they could have made if they'd invested in this stock 6 months sooner, we could have made, $500,000 in this amount of time, this kind of thing. If you were to try to quantify the bliss of the experience of Bhagavan, which according to the Taittiriya Upanishad is, whatever, I think it's like 16 powers of 10 to get to Brahmananda from the pleasure of the greatest, most pleasurable state of human being, which is better than any of this money that can produce the happiness that any of this money of greedy corporate guys can experience in today's society. So you're already talking about, 20 powers of 10 greater bliss times infinity. So that's quite an opportunity cost. So if Maya's influence is such that the jiva doesn't feel content in that state of oblivion, that's kind of good, actually. Or in other words, something that is putting a limitation on the jiva remaining perpetually in that oblivion can also be conceived as a favorable influence. That's a broader point. Anyhow, I've given something here about the sense of punishment, the sense of the pishachi. So what is the similarity then? There's also a reason why this comparison to the pishachi is being given. So that's also to be said. So the similarity is that pishachis, or if we use a more Western example of a ghost who's said to haunt people, then sometimes people describe as like, this person is crazy, or like in Bengali there's a saying like there's a bhoot in his head, like there's a ghost in his head, means he went crazy, So the influence of Maya is comparable to the influence of a pishachi in the sense that it does produce a state of delusion and a state of self-detrimental behavior on the part of the person who's influenced. So when one of these pisachis possesses someone, they go crazy, they do all these terrible things, and they do things that even perpetuate their own suffering. And as such, they become miserable and pitiable. So the jiva under the influence of Maya also exists in a deluded state, also suffers many different types of miseries, also is very pitiable in that condition, and also perpetuates that unfortunate condition that they're in for themselves once they're under that influence. So that's the similarity between the two. That's why the metaphor is being drawn out. to influence more this idea of self-detrimental behavior in a state of delusion. This is how the condition of the conditioned soul is being portrayed or being indicated to be by this metaphor. So then that's developed in the next payar, which I'll get to in a sec. The last point I'll just make is that the second half of the payar says that Maya withers and torments the jiva with the three miseries. So this term three miseries is found in the Bhagavatam, the Vishnu Puran, other Puranas, and it's just a way of categorizing the totality of suffering in samsara. I've given here in the comments some definitions of these from Sridhara Swami in his commentary on the Vishnu Puran. And in the Vishnu Puran, there's a kind of an extended breakdown of how these three categories are made. But ultimately, it's not that significant what falls into all of these categories. It's just a way of summarizing the fact that we suffer because of our own body and mind, we suffer because of other entities, and we suffer because of natural disasters or the influence of devatas, depending on how you want to describe it. And in this case, those particulars are not all that significant. It's just a way of summarizing that all of these things collectively are how Maya influences this conditioned jiva, such that the jiva experiences suffering in its condition within samsara. So, that the more crucial point of that suffering is discussed now in the next payar. This is 14. It says, Kama krodera dasa hoya tar latikai Brahmite jadi sadhu vaidyapai Tarupadesh mantre pishachi palai Krishna bhakti pai tabe Krishna nikata jai. Being servants of kama, or desire and anger, they suffer the kicks thereof. While wandering throughout samsara in this way, if they find a sadhu doctor, the pishachi will flee from the mantra of his instructions. Then they attain Krishna bhakti and go to Krishna's vicinity. So, tar latikai is a kind of a rich way of speaking in Bengali. The verb kawa is the most common verb used in the language to eat. When you say, like, I ate breakfast, you use that verb. But interestingly, there's an etymological range of this word eat, where it's also used specifically when you have to suffer something. They describe that as eating, or in the sense of consuming, in the sense of having to undergo, but it's a way of speaking which makes the experience of suffering more acute. In other words, it's not so much just like something that happens, it's something that you eat. It's like, not that that's literally what a Bengali will think in their mind when they use that word. The etymology of, the idiom of it, carries that broader sense. But it carries like a little bit more vivid way of acutely describing the experience of suffering. So to say that they suffer or, eat the kicks of this is to allude to, if you're being bewitched by some pishachi, the way that this abuse would come from this fearsome fiend is, elaborating or flushing out more of the metaphor here. So you've got this pishachi spooking you, and now you're getting like kicked by these things that this pishachi subjects you to. This is pretty miserable condition to be in if you're like on the ground crying, getting kicked in front of this like flesh-devouring fiend. It's like, okay. So very strong language, very strong metaphor. Obviously for the point of what they call satarkata, creating some sense of caution and alertness about one's existential condition. So here the word is simply vaidya, or doctor, but what this really means is an exorcist. So a sadhu is now compared to an exorcist in this metaphor. So for this person who's suffering this state of being attacked by this fiend, what do you need? You need an exorcist who can come and scare away this pishachi from you, remove this pishachi from you. So what do? Okay, so this exorcist will crack open the Atharva Veda, or whatever text they have, which describes the mantras that have to be used and chanted in order to remove these ghosts. And this is a very common thing even up until the present day within Indian society. I can't say I've experienced it myself, but I've definitely met Indian people who've told me that they've personally witnessed exorcists chanting mantras over people that are spooked and the people suddenly becoming perfectly healthy again. And there's loads of folklore going back hundreds and hundreds of years, and tales in the life of Thakur Mahashaya and others of our sampradaya about these kind of things. So this is, in the cultural context, this is a very well-known and very vivid example. So as an exorcist with mantras can remove this ghost or this pishachi from a person, then the sadhu's teachings, or in other words, the sadhu's teaching of the Shastra, of the teaching of Bhagavan himself, is like that mantra, which removes Maya as this mantra removes a pishachi. So this is the metaphor. In other words, the delusion that you're in can be dispelled by learning from the sadhu the teaching of the Shastra. And that was how this whole dynamic was already summarized in chapter 20, verses 117, 120, around there, where this same point was initially touched upon at the beginning of this discourse between Mahaprabhu and Sanatana Gosvami Pad. But what's also significant here is the attention drawn to the role of desire and anger, or kama and krodha. So here it's said that one is a servant of these things. So I've refrained from conjugating this hoya verb as becoming and stuck with being to emphasize the beginninglessness of this state. So although we do hear in the language of the Caritamrta this idea that the Jiva, quote, forgets Bhagavan or becomes deluded, that is spoken within the context of a beginningless phenomena. So although it sounds or seems to imply that there was a previous non-existence of that oblivion or of that servitude to kama, it's not actually the case. So that's why I've preferred to render it in this way, to minimize that. So here when we say kama, then we heard already in the beginning of the Caritamrta that kama is defined as the desire to please one's own senses. Atmendriya priti bancha, tare boli kam. In contrast to prem, which is the desire to please Krishna's senses. So the desire to please your own senses is called kama. The desire to please Krishna's senses is called prema. But more subtly, in the context of Leela, there can also be activities that appear to be actions that are for the purpose of pleasing one's own senses. And those actions can also be prema if they're performed with the underlying intent, or the word, quote, tatparya, to please Krishna. In other words, if Krishna wants to have fun, and you know that he has fun when other people around him are having fun, and he wants to have a picnic and enjoy lunch, and you say, yeah, pass me the, whatever you're eating, then that desire to eat this tasty thing that he's eating when you're his mate, cowherd boy, then that desire to please your senses with that food that he is eating is actually very pleasing to him. And the cowherd boys will actually do that for his pleasure. So there is a context in which you can, quote, desire to please your own senses, but the tatparya, or the intent of that desire, is actually the pleasure of Krishna. So a little bit later in that same section, in the 4th chapter of the Adi Lila, it's again emphasized, this phrase, kamera tatparya nija sambhog kevala. That in the context of kama, in the conventional sense, the intent is only upon one's own enjoyment. So when you desire your own pleasure, and you desire your own pleasure only for your own pleasure, then that's officially kama. So both the desire and the thrust, or the broader aim of the desire, when they're both self-centered, that is precisely what is classically referred to as kama. So this kama is discussed, in the Gita, where it's mentioned as the cause of sin, and the cause of even people who know better and don't want to commit sin, still committing sin. So I bring that up because when it describes the jiva here as suffering the kicks of kama and krodha, or of maya in the form of kama and krodha, then one way we can understand that is that when one becomes a servant, here it says dasohaya, being a servant of kama, meaning when one's mind becomes conditioned by kama such that you act according to the inclinations in the mind that are arising from kama, that's what's being referred to by serving kama or being a servant of kama, then you suffer the kicks. So what does that mean? It means then you do sinful activities, or you do activities that cause further suffering, and then you undergo those consequences. So when your psyche is conditioned predominantly by kama, then the majority of your actions are actions that produce severe suffering as a consequence. So that's in gist what's being alluded to here. And I've given in the commentary a little bit more on this topic. Baladevidya he defines kama more specifically also as, in addition to a desire to please your own senses, a desire for objects of the senses for the sake of pleasing your own senses. So, in other words, here the word kama, the scope, is specifically the scope of the conditioned jiva's experience of the realm of samsara. And that this kama is an outcome of the vasanas, or the inclinations that are embedded in the psyche as a consequence of past karma. So this is why the two things are related. In other words, how did this kama get into the mind of this jiva who's oblivious of Krishna? Because in that oblivion, the jiva is beginninglessly influenced by maya, therefore the jiva has beginningless karma, therefore the jiva has beginningless vasanas for kama, therefore the jiva has beginningless kama, therefore the jiva is beginninglessly undergoing the suffering thereof. So this is all the psychology that's implied in these brief statements. So in that situation, then it says, brahmite, brahmite, wandering and wandering. So that refers to not just, around the park in the afternoon because you're bored. That means, perpetually for beginningless lifetimes in the realm of samsara through so many births and so many circumstances. And then it says, if. So that's also significant. That implies that there's no guarantee that you'll find the exorcist that will free you from this delusion isn't guaranteed. It's what's called yadrichaya. It comes of its own accord independently. It's not even Bhagavan's will, it's not even directly Bhagavan's grace, as we heard in the Bhakti Sandarbha. Jiva Gosvami goes into a lot of subtlety there to say that it's ultimately the independent initiative of bhaktas who have both remembrance of what it's like to suffer in samsara and full regard for the value of sammukya, or complete awareness and ultimately bhakti to Bhagavan. And for that particular category of sadhu that is not so deeply steeped in awareness and devotion to Bhagavan that they've completely transcended material existence, and consideration of anything else, but that they still retain some remembrance of what it's like for the people in oblivion and how they suffer. For that middle group of sadhu, there can arise some initiative to grace or to benefit another who's suffering in that oblivion. So if it so happens in the currents of destiny that one encounters such a person at such a stage, in such a condition of oneself where one is somehow receptive to that, then this exorcism can take place, if you're lucky. It's not the easiest process. And there'll be much more on that topic a little bit later in the chapter about how sadhu sangha comes to be, what takes place in the course of it, and so forth. So now a very beautiful verse comes, a citation to illustrate these three pairs that we've just discussed. And it's cited in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, but no edition of the Sindhu gives a precise source of it. So I've never been able to trace what original text it comes from. But it's a fairly well-known statement, and a very apt citation here to illustrate what is being described. So I'll discuss this verse and then conclude for the evening. Kamadinam katina katida palita turnideshas tesham jatamaina karuna natrapa nupashanti Utsri jaitan natu jalupate sampratam labda buddhis Tam hayata sharanam abhayam mam niyukshvatmadasye. How often have how many wicked dictates of kama and so forth not been obeyed by me? Still, neither their compassion for me, nor shame, nor pacification have ever come about. Now, thereafter, O Lord of the Yadus, having attained proper awareness, I have abandoned them and come to you, the shelter free from fear. Please engage me in your personal service. So I've rendered this literally, and in this case I quite prefer the literal expression. I find that most of the Bengali translators, they render in a little more intelligible sense that I've followed the wicked dictates of kama and krodha for so long in so many ways. But actually it doesn't just say, I've done it so much. It says, how often, how much have I not done it? So when you've really done something a lot, then it's harder to say if you've ever not done it. Have I ever not? No, that indicates a far greater percentage. If you just say I've done it a lot, then you might think, well, maybe sometimes you didn't. But if you say, have I ever not done it, then you're really saying you might have done it all the time. So it's a little stronger of an expression. So what this is an expression of repentance and an expression of self-awareness and reflection on one's condition, and an acceptance and a recognition of what the conditioning of one's psyche may be. And to say that, have I ever not even once not been driven by kama and so on? And we hear in the Manusmriti, no, there's no action performed by anyone in the world that's not driven by kama. But we could say that that Manusmriti statement could refer to a broader sense of kama than the type of kama referred to here, which, as I mentioned, and that's why I gave him a tightened down definition as desire for vishoy, desire for objects of the senses arising from an intent specifically for one's own pleasure. Because broadly speaking, there are also sadhus and mahatmas and others who may dwell in the world without being motivated by that type of desire, but by another type. But the point here is we're referring to this problematic type of kama. And of course it also says quote, and so forth, adinam. So that refers to what comes consequentially from kama. So classically these are referred to as the 6 enemies. Second being anger, that which arises when kama is obstructed. Third being greed, that which arises when kama becomes very condensed. And fourth being delusion or moda, what comes about when greed becomes very strong or anger becomes very strong, one loses awareness of what is ought to be done, ought not to be done. And then abhiman or mottata can come about, some type of arrogance or some type of boldness in one's behavior where without regard for what is to be done, angrily or greedily motivated for a desire, one acts in a way that's very irreverent or harsh in relation to others. And then the most severe development, what is called matsarya or envy, where one becomes intolerant of another who may have the object of desire that one has, or intolerant of another's possession of what is the means to the object of desire that one has, such that one fosters enmity for others and oneself feels a great deal of unrest within oneself about what the other has, for want of, out of greed or anger about what one desires for oneself. So in a nutshell, this is what is referred to by the and so forth. And when it's describing here that they have dictates or nidesha, so it means like orders. So why is it said like that? So that's why I quoted the verse of the Gita in the previous commentary where Arjuna asks Krishna, why do people sin even when they know better? And says, because kama covers over what they know and prompts them to do it anyway. Even when you know better, you still do stuff wrong. You still do the very thing that if your mind is cool, you wouldn't ever do under the influence of kama. So that's why the influence of kama here is compared to a dictate or an order. It's something that's forcing you to do something. But it's called wicked because it's making you suffer and it's perpetuating your suffering. And moreover, it's wicked for what's stated in the second line, that this kama has no compassion for you, no shame in constantly controlling what you do, and never becomes pacified no matter what you do. So this is comparable to being like a slave master. If you're a cruel master and you have a slave, then you have no compassion for them. You just want whatever you want out of them. You have no shame in exploiting them. And no matter how much they do, you'll never stop. You'll never be like, oh, that's good enough. You'll just keep taking whatever you can. So in the modern day, we have, ethics of employers and business bureaus and stuff like this, where there's lines that you have about employees. They're entitled to vacations. They're entitled to working conditions. They're entitled to certain treatment with respect. They're entitled to days off and, a certain number of hours a day and all of this. So kama, krodha, etc., they're not obeying any of these, modern civil notions. They're like these cruel slave masters just cracking the whip. And the more you work, the more work they'll give you. And the more you suffer, the less they care. They don't care at all. So suppose you were looking for happiness. Maybe. Suppose that's the case. Then would you ever find it being a slave of this kind of master? If you work for someone who just brutally exploits you and never lets you up, no matter how much you go, they'll never be satisfied. You'll never find peace. You'll never find happiness. So the situation of the conditioned jiva with the psyche programmed with this kind of kama and all of its effects is like that. It's just a never-ending cruel grind that the force that's driving you to do all of this has no compassion for you whatsoever. No tendency to withdrawal or lighten up on you at all, and will never be pacified and stop. So he says, now thereafter I attained proper understanding. In other words, now I understood finally that this is not a good idea. As long as I obey these wicked dictates, as long as I have this master, this evil slave master called Kama, I'm never gonna have peace, I'm never gonna be happy. Then let me have a different master then. Rather than serving Kama, why don't I serve Bhagavan? Because Bhagavan is the opposite. He has compassion. He has more compassion than anyone. He doesn't have a shameless tendency to exploit you. He has your very best interest at heart. And he's not never pacified no matter how much work you do. Alpo seva bahumane atma parjanta prasad. There's a beautiful payar later in the Caitanya-caritamrta. It says, satisfied with just a little seva, he'll give you even himself. Satisfied with a little seva, he'll give you himself. And this slave master will exploit you for eternity and never give you anything. So, labdha buddhi, when you get some sense, then you might consider, who do I do better to serve? This Bhagavan, whose shelter is fearless, with who will never cheat me, never exploit me, never hurt me, never take advantage of me, who I have nothing to fear in the least, or this cruel, wicked influence that is literally just a perpetual cause of fear. So, therefore he prays, please, Prabhu, engage me in your seva, or please bless me with the privilege to serve you instead of the dictates of Maya and so on. So, last little point I'll make here is that there are two ways to read the second line of the verse. When it's the way I've given the initial meaning, where it says that this compassion, shame, and pacification, they're all conceived of as belonging to Kama. Kama has no compassion, it has no shame, it's never pacified or satisfied. That's one way it's read. Another way it's interpreted by some commentators is that the compassion goes with the Kama. In other words, Kama has no compassion for you. So in other words, I've obeyed the dictates of Kama for so long, but I have no shame, and I've found no pacification. So they interpret it as more as an expression of repentance, or of self-recognition of fault, that I've done so many foolish things, so many detrimental things to myself and others, and I don't even feel any shame about it. I know in the modern day people are all like hyped up on shame and toxicity and all this. In this context, shame is healthy. Shame is not like some problematic psychological thing. Shame is just simply self-awareness of the consequences of one's own behavior upon oneself and others, in this context. So that I would do this much and never felt any shame about it, that's a lack of self-insight. And that I've never been pacified. I myself just keep pursuing all of these desires and I never become satisfied, but I just pursue the next one, I just pursue the next one, I just pursue the next one. I never have the thought to think whether it's worth it or whether this next thing that I'm now running after is actually going to ever satisfy me, unlike everything else that never did. So it can also be read in that sense, that I'm shamelessly, stupidly, insatiably running after this thing that, makes no sense. So in the Bhagavad, there's some nice statements in the 9th canto that speak about this point, that Kama is something insatiable, utterly insatiable, whether you conceive of that as an aspect of yourself or you conceive of it as the aspect of the Kama itself. It said that it's like fire. The more ghee you put into it, the more it burns. And that's the import of in the Gita, when it's called, when it just says insatiable in the Gita, then the commentators, they cite this section of the Bhagavatam to illustrate that. So no matter how much you feed it, that much more it will consume. This is the nature of, or why there's no pacification of the kama. So how does this change come about? How does someone finally decide, now I'm going to leave these things? So the implication here is that now, that time of now, came about because of you met the exorcist. You met the sadhu who gave the mantra, who gave the instructions by which you understood this. So that's also further developed later in the chapter, but that's the import also of the citation in the context of the metaphor that it's being cited in, that you acquire that sense as a consequence of receiving those instructions. And then, of your own accord, out of your own conviction, you take shelter in Bhagavan. So from there, the conversation goes into the discussion of Krishna Bhakti, or then when that person gets that sense that serving Bhagavan is the best thing that I could be doing, it's rightfully the kartabhya or the videya, the thing that is to be done by me, then they take to that process. So from here, the conversation goes into the nature of bhakti as this abhideya, or this principal directive of the Shastra about what is to be practiced, and why it's bhakti that's to be done and not gyan or karma or other varieties of yoga. Because thus far, this analysis of the conditioning, you could say, okay, I'm suffering in samsara, I'm suffering from kama, but why don't I become a jnani? Why don't I become a yogi? They also supposedly can free me from all of that suffering and free me from samsara and free me from kama and so forth. So wouldn't that work too? Or it only has to be bhakti? Or it could be both? Or how does this fit together? Those questions are all discussed in the next section of the text. And spoiler alert, the idea is that bhakti is the inherent potency that enables all of those paths to produce the effects that they do. And there's a marginal presence of bhakti even in the path of Gyan, and that's what makes the path of Gyan effective for what it is. And there's a marginal presence of bhakti even in the process of yoga that enables the process of yoga to produce the results that it does. However, those results are lesser in value than the results that are produced by the path of bhakti, and they're dependent on that bit of bhakti in those paths in order to come about. So therefore, you'll do best and you'll get an even superior result than any of those other paths can grant by taking up the path of bhakti. So that's what comes in the following section of the text, and then from there it goes into more specificity about how the path of bhakti enters one's life. So I'll conclude here. If anyone has comments, questions, corrections, or other feedback of any type, they're welcome to share at this time.
Pranam, yes, I have a question.
Okay.
For a person who aspires to experience prema rather than pleasing his or her own senses, in practical terms, like considering, like from the point of view of modern psychology, for example, what would be the practical method if, for example, we take a situation, if such a person, he or she finds himself to be depressed, let's say something happens, and like from the point of view of psychology, it's natural, like to try to please one's senses. It's like ingrained in human psyche. So in such a moment, what would be the practical advice? What should be the devotee's train of thought and train of actions, so to speak, to transmute or transform that desire to please one's senses, to please Krishna's senses and experience prema instead of rather experiencing pleasure of one's own senses? What to do, like in the practical terms, how to transmute that desire in a like in practice?
Well, the central point of reflection would be that performing an action or fostering a desire which is pleasing to Krishna is my goal as a sadhaka. Or if I'm an aspirant to follow the path of bhakti, then this is the type of desire, this is the type of focus that I aspire to foster. So I then prioritize that in my mind. So when thoughts and desires arise that are contrary to that, then I may note them, I may observe them, but I won't necessarily immediately act upon them. I'll exert my discernment and let them pass or dismiss them with thoughts about why they're not worthy of being acted upon or what have you, as I may so be able at some time. And of course, as it's said in that section of the Gita that I was referring to, one is not always able to do this, but if one can at least sometimes be able to, and can at least try, that actually will get one quite a long way. So, to accept the favorable, reject the unfavorable, this is the central premise of being a Sharanagata. So, thoughts that are contrary to the ideal will be dismissed / critiqued, if you will, and then thoughts which are conducive will be fostered, will be acted upon. This is the fundamental formula. So sometimes, depending on the situation, if you're talking about someone who's experiencing depression or something that's an acute type of psychological challenge or an acute state of issue, then they may not always be able to go so much into the kind of precise line of thought of the bhakti process in all of those states. So that's also to be borne in mind that sometimes there's an intermediate process that may be necessary at some times. And if I take a step back, so to speak, I just remember one time I had an experience of meeting a person by a strange set of circumstances who was extremely tamasic. And I was in a car, this person was giving me a ride in a car for like an hour and a half on this one occasion. And I was trying to say some things and the responses were so extremely tamasic and surprising to me that I was really like rubbing my head as like I hadn't heard such take on spiritual topics to such a degree that I finally came in my mind, what to speak of speaking about something nirgun with this person or even sattvic with this person, if this person could be just explained a little bit about rajagun, that would be good for them. In other words, depending on their state of mind, it may not be possible to introduce these type of things. So in a similar way, depending on one's state of mind, one also may need to take care of oneself where one is at, depending on the circumstances. In other words, one may not always be in a state where they can think purely for the satisfaction of Krishna. They may need to just do some self-care at some time. So they can, at that time, also think in a broader sense that I'm doing this with the broader perspective, in the broader context of sustaining my own well-being so that in the course of my life and in my future I can proceed in this spiritual path and engage in these spiritual aspirations that I aspire to. So it doesn't have to necessarily be that every single action has to map out on this principle at all times, especially if one's dealing with acute types of psychological challenges. But in a practical level or on a lighter level, then if we find and engage in activities of bhakti that we relish and that we like, then that the momentum of that will carry us and engage us in so many things that if we're getting depressed or confused or down or something like that, all you have to do is remember, wait a minute, why am I thinking all these things rather than what I love to do? And then you just start doing that and it disappears. So depending on the circumstances, the acuteness of the situation, something as simple as just reminding yourself by opening a book or opening a lecture or, sitting in front of your altar, or anything that just can redirect your awareness towards these things, and then a few thoughts on that vein, and then poof, whatever, emotions or thoughts were going in another direction just kind of evaporate when that central thrust of what one is cultivating all throughout one's sadhana is again brought to the forefront of one's awareness. The momentum, the richness of that will again carry one for some time. So that's one side, more extreme cases another side, and according to wherever we're at, then we try to proceed accordingly.
That's clear, understood. Thank you very much, Baba. I just have one more question, a little one, because the term to please one's senses is such a broad term. It could imply so many different things. For example, let's consider the same situation. That person is depressed and he experiences the desire to eat some chocolate because chocolate gives happiness. It's like even proved by science. Would it be considered to be like a desire to please one's senses instead of like pleasing Bhagavan's senses, or like offering the chocolate to Bhagavan in one's mind would be like transmuted into like serving Bhagavan to bring oneself to the state where one can actually do some better service or something like that? Like, is it kind of acceptable, or is it like just not acceptable, so to speak?
Yeah, practically speaking, the ins and outs of all these details are not all that important. So, in order to engage in our sadhana, we have to upkeep our body, we have to sustain our health. So what's conducive to that? We do that for the sake of serving. And, what type of food or dietary content one finds conducive to that, that's fine. It's not that big of a deal. I mean, obviously, we avoid things that are tamasic or things that cause suffering and violence to other living beings, etc., etc., etc. But within that context, what we do with the majority of our day is more important than the few minutes we spend putting food in the body to give us the energy to do that. So, in that sense, whatever is practical to keep one going is more or less fine. And, whatever one takes, one offers and accepts that as prasad. Thakur Mahashaya says, Kam Krishna Karmarpane. He also says, what you desire, offer it to Krishna. That's one way of transmuting it. In other words, if you do something really bad, well then repent and pray to Krishna and, leverage the energy of the mistake into something that again reminds you of Krishna and engages you in an activity of Krishna. So you have to eat something, okay, make an offering, enable that to also bring about awareness, remembrance, some devotional practice, take it as prasadam, carry on. And what is the exact content of what you're offering? As far as I'm concerned, it's not that big of a deal. Whatever you find practical is suitable for you personally.
Okay, it's just chocolate. For me, it's very difficult for me to give up chocolate, especially when I am sad. That's why the question is coming from. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I see another hand.
Just to continue, can I add here one point here? Because in Visvanatha Cakravarti comments on the verse from Puranas, that one should remember Krishna. The two principles actually exist on to remember Vishnu all the time and not forget him ever, right? So, and then he explains it's not possible to remember Krishna every second. So the point of this instruction is to remember him every day, at least once a day, or regularly. So that's anyway. I have a question. Babaji. Actually, I have so many questions, but I can choose one only. So, in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says that one has to act according to his nature, and even saints have to act according to their nature. So this always brings me to the point of like Sharanagati, surrender. I remember Sadhana Babaji was mentioning, when you come to Guru, you just burn your house, in a sense of like you forget who you are, you trash everything that you that actually they make you what you are, in a sense of part of this material world, and you burn everything of that identification and establish new house. So I'm just contemplating on that for a long time, because what does it really mean by nature, and what is personal nature? Because how is it different from samskaras? Because someone may have nature that is conducive for bhakti, and someone may not. And how one can act according to his nature if the nature is not really facilitating that in full extent, the Sharanagati part. Hopefully I'm clear with my question here.
I think so. So, samskaras, vasanas, the collective effect of these, what is called the swabhava in the Gita, these are not things that change in one day. These are not things that we can just, send out with the garbage men and, that's it. But when we hear about statements of, quote unquote, relinquishing them or renouncing them or transforming oneself, etc., what, practically speaking, that can mainly refer to is a state of mind in which one ceases to identify with all of those things as being who one must remain. And in the context of spiritual life or taking shelter of a guru, essentially what that is embracing a specific ideal about who one wants to become. And in the sense of what one holds in the purview of the direction one is going, in that space to burn the house or remove other things, not to keep some other thing and say, yeah, I want to be a bhakta in this and I want this also, and then it gets all messy and confused. But when you say, I want this spiritual goal, this is my one and only goal, I am one-pointedly prioritizing this above everything. And whatever I do is in pursuit, maybe secondarily, of that. I have to clothe the body, I have to have a place to live, etc. I may, go work in my garden or paint my house. It's like, you might say, well, what does that have to do with bhakti? But if it's practical for pursuing that ideal, then that's part of it. So the main thing is then to set and refine what is that ideal that one aspires to as per the blessing, as per the teaching of the guru. And then everyone's experience of the pursuit of that will be different because everyone is starting from a different point on the map. And whatever the particular conditioning of one's psyche is, whatever the swabhava that one has at this birth, in this juncture in eternity, may be a little closer or further from the mark than someone else they know, and may have a little bit more favorability or unfavorability to that ideal than others we might observe in the world. So we might not find certain things as easy as it seems as they are for others. Or we might find certain things easy that strangely other people don't find so easy. Who knows? That's unique to the trajectory, the circumstances of every individual. So what will be part of one's swabhava that's already very favorable and is a great strength in one's spiritual journey may be there for someone, and for another not. Or for another it may be of a different type. So we just have to work with who we are, where we're at, and we can't really compare ourselves to others much. But we can rather try to have self-awareness about the clarity of the ideal that I have, and clarity about the condition of my psyche as it is now. And then I can look at where the ability, the scope that I have to engage in these practices and to ideally achieve some degree of what is called chitta shuddhi, or purification of the psyche, such that certain thoughts, identifications, behaviors, etc. fall away, which are unfavorable to or not part of the ideal that I aspire to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand that.
Did I don't know if I caught the whole topic that you wanted to bring up.
Yes. Yeah, I understand that it's variegatedness amongst different sadhakas because of their own particular placement in the lifespan of eternity span of their existence. See, the thing is that someone may face, because of its nature, let's say, I'm not talking about karma in the sense of, I'm not concerned about karma or, gross way, but some sadhakas may come to the path or surrender and reject everything prematurely, because later on in life, the thing that they always wanted to do and they rejected in material life, and in spiritual life they rejected it, they come back as a big punch in the end of later on in life, and they find themselves like compulsed to fulfill it. And they face the situation, should I fulfill this desire that was long cultivated in me, I was depressed all the time, in order to fulfill it and pass on to next life without disturbance, or reject it anyway and risking that this samskara, this particular unfulfilled desires would pop out or strong in next life, or maybe even in this life they will be dying thinking of, I've wasted my life, I didn't fulfill that, I have bhakti, but still I have this unfulfilled desire. Let's say somebody who wanted to become doctor or whatever, that's some desire that has never been fulfilled, but it's very important for that person. But in the context of spiritual life, it became minimized, but the person really didn't weigh properly the value of who he is or she is, and that desire still remains, it was also in the background, and that popped up in the end of their life somewhere very strongly, and they face this duality. Should I fulfill it and pass it on, or just trash it anyway and risking that I'll be very disturbed in my spiritual life anyway, and it will be fulfilled next life. So it's kind of dilemma. Fulfill it now, fulfill it later, or will it disappear? Right? Because when sadhakas go through life, we're talking about considerable few decades of sadhana. They have more questions than they had before. And they face more subtleties in their progress and approaching their own natures. But am I being clear? I'm not sure if it's the point.
I think so. I'm reminded of what Chakravarti Pad calls in the I think it's Madhurya Kadambini, Vyuda Vikalpa. This state of indecision and a certain wavering between different potential courses of action, and the weight of one's vasanas for whatever it is that one is inclined to when they're in tension with the varieties of sadhana or spiritual practices that one has aspired to in the past or the present, then one will waver between or feel some lack of fixity about doing one or the other or both or when, how much, where. And that he describes this as a stage that people go through on the path. So this is as the swabhava, as the vasanas for other things is gradually, ideally speaking, gradually diminishing if one is engaging in the process, then that, the overarching influence that they have may gradually wane in comparison to the bhakti samskara, the bhakti vasana that's being nourished by the sadhana process daily, ideally, provided one is doing, daily sadhana and provided one is not committing aparad. So as that balance of power, if you will, within the psyche is gradually changing, one will feel different states of affinity or different degrees of inclination towards those different sides within themselves. And, some people may go to a certain level and then go back and say, nope, I'm not ready to go that far into this bhakti spiritual stuff. I want this other stuff still for a while. So that's okay, if that's what people are, feel compelled to do for a certain stage or a particular time, then we have eternity to carry on with that. And, if they do it in a manner that doesn't perpetuate what is contrary to the path, that's better than doing it in a way that at least might be still parallel to it. But ultimately, what we aspire to in the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition and in the path of Uttama Bhakti is a razor sharp, very, very high spiritual ideal, which is what it is. In other words, it's an amazingly beautiful prospect which seems worth forsaking everything else or paying the price of forsaking everything else to attain. But the actual process of purging oneself of interest and attachment to all else is certainly not easy. So it's up to individuals according to where they're at and where they're comfortable to maintain a balance and keep the pressure on or keep the momentum going towards the ideal at the rate and in the intensity of spirit that they feel comfortable with. And it's seen that there can be some initial enthusiasm which wears off and some lack of understanding of the depth of what's actually involved and a lack of understanding of the depth of the conditioning that one has towards things that are contrary. And that can be daunting and sometimes require some regrouping or some, process of taking some time to collect oneself, if you will, and then replot one's progressive attempt. But, the purpose of all this discussion, the purpose of all this siddhanta is ultimately to give us a very crystal clear idea of what's really worth aspiring to. And as far as we can, wherever we're at, if we can, proceed towards that as far as we're able, that's to the extent to which we're highly benefited.
Right. I think you hit the point here because, nail on the head, because yes, someone may consider, I'm not ready, but still having very clear appreciation and target in his mind, but he need to pause, or she needs to pause for a while. Would that be the summary of what you just said?
Yeah, the quote-unquote need would be subjective. In other words, in the impartial objective sense, that need isn't necessarily there. It's felt by the person under the weight of the attachments that they have, but nevertheless, better to quote-unquote pause than to, jettison the whole process or or come up with some, reinterpretation of things where you justify this as actually being that, or you water down the thing that you're aspiring to into what you're attached to. Better to keep the demarcation between the two and just say, I'm gonna stick to this for a bit and gradually get over there, than convince yourself that you can do this and have that too, or convince yourself that this is actually that.
Right, because we consider eternity of our conditioning, and there's you started off class with stressing the word if you meet this person, if you are properly disposed of that exorcist to heal you, if quite a few ifs were there, so it leaves, and then it leaves us in the context of eternity, and we've been always conditioned, and don't even trace where's the fault of Jiva here. So it seems like we are being played, I would say, and just basically just by understanding the whole reality of bhakti, a reality of bhakti and existence of prema as the only viable purpose. But just by understanding that and understanding our own very minuscule position, one really can safely position himself or herself in a position of waiting, really. I mean, active waiting, but it's just basically, as I see sadhana as a waiting period for the grace to come. And whatever it takes, whatever Jiva has to do within the journey on the path to this grace, it has to do. Whatever has to be done, has to be done. But truly speaking, we have so little control over result of our sadhana. Isn't that right to say, or?
Yeah, it's always a balance between the two. If we look at all the broader causal factors, we can see how narrow that margin of influence or control that we have is. It's very narrow. But at the same time, in that scope of narrowness, that's a big responsibility on our part, and we're highly accountable for how we act within that little tiny scope that we have. You could call it wiggle room, if you will.
It's a wiggle.
So how you lean, how you wiggle, it matters. We can't just say, "Oh, I can hardly do anything." Well, you better at least wiggle right.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay. Oh, that satisfies me. Okay. And I have so many questions because this topic is so massive. But anyway, I'll leave it for now. Maybe next class. Thank you, Babaji.
Sure. Main thing is that our Brajendra Nandan has such madhurya. If we hear about that, then come on, what else should we listen to? What else should we hear about? What else is there to be so concerned about?
Yes, more of that. And it also leads me to thinking that actually what upasana is, the worship. Upasana is more worship, but actually etymologically, upasana means sitting close, right? Close to who? Close to where? To Guru, right? Who will give you that madhurya, right? So I find that living this away from sadhusanga, from Guru, is just detrimental actually for spirituality. You need to be sitting close.
Well, we've got technology, we've got means. Whatever we've got, we got to use it. Wherever we are. All right. Well, it's pretty late here on this end, so let's cap it for today. And if we're so blessed, we'll continue this discussion next week. Or, well, actually, no. There will be a break for some weeks now, according to the Institute schedule. So when time comes to resume, we'll happily do so. All right. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah.
Jai Radhe.
Jai Guru, Jai Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.
Jai Radhe. Jai Radhe.
Jai Radhe Shyam.